Welcome back to Legacy of Throne. Before we begin tonight's extraordinary journey through one of the most remarkable stories in all of human history, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you never miss our next deep dive into the civilizations that shaped our world. On this channel, we uncover the rise of empires, forgotten turning points, and the secrets behind the cities and rulers that changed everything. Subscribe now, because history belongs to those who choose to remember it. Imagine a city that by every ordinary measure should never have existed at all. A city with almost no land worth mentioning, no rich farmland spreading out to the horizon, no silver mines buried in nearby hills, no dense forests providing timber close at hand, no great army marching under its command across solid ground. A city built not on firm, reliable earth, but on mud, marsh, and saltwater, on the shifting, unreliable, waterlogged foundation of a coastal lagoon, where the tides rose and fell twice a day, where the winds cut sharp across the open flats, and where the ground itself seemed too uncertain and too treacherous to ever trust with anything permanent. By every logical standard, such a place should have remained a scattering of temporary huts, a refuge of last resort at best, and then slowly sunk back beneath the brackish water from which it had barely risen. And yet, for 1,000 years, 1,000 continuous, extraordinary years, this impossible place became one of the richest, most resilient, most diplomatically sophisticated, and most widely admired states in the world. It became the gateway between East and West, a republic of merchants that grew into a maritime empire stretching across the Mediterranean. It became the city that bargained with emperors, commanded fleets of hundreds of warships, financed crusades, dominated trade routes, connecting 3 continents, and produced art, architecture, music, and culture that still takes the breath away of everyone who encounters it. This is the story of Venice. And like all the best stories, it begins not with triumph or glory, but with something far more human and far more universal. It begins with fear. So, before you get comfortable tonight, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. It is always wonderful to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The beginning of Venice was not planned by visionary dreamers or drawn up by ambitious architects in the service of some powerful king. No emperor pointed toward the lagoon and declared that a glorious city should rise there as a monument to his greatness. No empire designed it as a proud administrative capital, intended to project power across the surrounding region. Venice began as something far more humble and far more desperate than any of that. It began as a place of refuge, a place that terrified, displaced people ran to when everything else around them was collapsing in fire and blood. In the 5th century after Christ, the Western Roman Empire was coming apart at its very foundations. The old order, which had once stretched in unbroken authority from the cold shores of Britain to the sun-baked plains of North Africa, from the Rhine and Danube in the north to the sands of the Sahara in the south, was cracking under pressure from every direction simultaneously. Roman roads still ran across the landscape. Roman cities still stood, their forums and aqueducts and theaters speaking of an engineering confidence that had seemed eternal. Roman villas still glittered in the Italian sun, their mosaic floors and frescoed walls embodying a civilization that had endured for centuries. But the confidence that had sustained that civilization, the deep, bone-level assurance that Rome was permanent, that the legions would always come, that the walls would always hold, was failing. The visible structures of empire remained, but the invisible spirit that had animated them was draining away. Northern Italy, deeply prosperous and thoroughly integrated into the Roman world, found itself exposed and vulnerable in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The security that had seemed as permanent as the hills was suddenly revealed as fragile. Trade routes were disrupted. Tax revenues were declining. Military garrisons were being withdrawn to defend more immediately threatened frontiers. And then came the shock that made the danger impossible to ignore or minimize any longer. From the vast steppes of Central Asia, sweeping westward with a ferocity and speed that had already devastated kingdoms and peoples across thousands of miles, came the Huns. To the settled populations of the Roman Mediterranean world, these nomadic warriors were terrifying beyond ordinary. A military threat, swift beyond anything the Roman cavalry could match, appearing without warning, destroying without mercy, leaving behind a landscape of burned settlements and abandoned fields. Their advance, associated in legend and later memory with the fearsome name of Attila, sent waves of genuine panic through the civilian populations of northeastern Italy. The Veneti, the Roman-era inhabitants of the prosperous region that still bears their name in the form of the Veneto, did what frightened human beings have instinctively done throughout history. When the world catches fire around them, they fled. Their flight, however, was not toward any obvious place of strength. They did not flee to a mountain fortress stocked with provisions and garrisoned with soldiers. They did not seek shelter behind the walls of some distant city, powerful enough to resist the tide. They fled, many of them, to the one place that cavalry simply could not easily follow: the broad, confusing, treacherous lagoon that stretched along the Adriatic coast of northeastern Italy. It was not a beautiful sanctuary when they arrived. It was nothing remotely like the Venice of later paintings, of Canaletto's luminous canal scenes, or the golden reflections captured by Turner. It was not the Venice of postcards and tourist fantasies, with marble facades shimmering in clear water and graceful bridges arching over quiet passages. It was a hostile, difficult, inhospitable landscape, a vast maze of mud flats, salt marshes, red beds, shallow channels, and low-lying islands that shifted their shapes with every significant storm and every seasonal change in the tides. It smelled of salt and wet earth and the particular organic richness of brackish wetlands. It was exposed to wind and weather in ways that inland settlements were not. It was uncomfortable in every season. It was poor in virtually every resource that made for comfortable life. And yet, it possessed one advantage that mattered infinitely more than comfort or beauty or convenience. One priceless characteristic that was worth more than all the fields and forests and stone walls that refugees had left behind. It was, in the most practical possible sense, extraordinarily difficult to attack. A mounted army, the dominant military force of the age, capable of thunder across the flat plains of the Po Valley and devastating any conventional defensive position in open country, was rendered essentially helpless in that watery labyrinth. Horses could not swim through the hidden channels. Heavy infantry in full Roman or Gothic armor would sink in the mud flats that looked like firm ground from a distance. The shallow waters concealed sandbanks that would ground any ship drawing significant depth. The twisting, unmarked channels through the marshes were incomprehensible to anyone who had not spent years learning them by direct experience. The lagoon formed a natural defensive system more effective than many carefully engineered walls, and it required no garrison to maintain itself. So the first Venetians were not conquerors celebrating a victory. They were not pioneers pursuing opportunity or adventurers seeking fortune. They were refugees, people who had lost their homes, their possessions, the certainty of their daily lives, and the ordinary, taken for granted shape of existence in a settled civilization. They were farmers whose fields were burning, merchants whose city warehouses had been looted, minor nobility whose estates were no longer safe, craftsmen whose workshops had been abandoned, entire families who had escaped with whatever they could carry on their backs or load onto a cart or a boat, and who had found themselves marooned in a place that seemed barely habitable by ordinary human standards. It is one of history's quieter and more profound ironies that one of Europe's greatest and most sophisticated powers, a state that would one day negotiate on equal terms with Byzantine emperors, Ottoman sultans, and the monarchs of France and Spain, began as an act of collective desperation by people who had nowhere else to go. Those early communities had no luxury of romance about their situation. They had to survive. They learned, with the particular intensity that comes from having no alternative, how to live with brackish water, with daily tides that changed the depth of every channel and the accessibility of every pathway, with the sudden violent storms that could sweep across the flat lagoon without warning, with the isolation from the mainland networks of supply and communication that ordinary life depended upon. Their new settlements rose on small islands and unstable muddy banks, and virtually every aspect of daily existence had to be adapted, reinvented, and improvised to suit the demands of an environment that had never been designed for permanent human habitation. There would be no road systems linking their settlements, no carts rolling over packed earth, no horses pulling loads from M1 district to another. Water defined movement, work, and the measurement of time itself. Boats were not accessories or conveniences. In such a world, they were the absolute, non-negotiable necessity without which nothing was possible. Even the simplest tasks, fetching fresh water, visiting neighbors, carrying materials for building, required a vessel and the knowledge to use it. Yet surviving there demanded more than sheer courage or stubborn endurance. It demanded invention of a very specific and practical kind. The great question facing every would-be builder in the lagoon was simple in its statement and merciless in its implications. How do you build anything lasting in mud? How do you raise houses, churches, storehouses, and quays structures that need to stand for decades or centuries when the ground beneath you seems not merely soft but actively, persistently eager to swallow anything placed upon it? The answer the Venetians eventually devised and perfected was one of the most ingenious and consequential pieces of practical engineering in the entire medieval world. They drove long, sharpened wooden piles deep down through the soft upper layers of the lagoon floor, not tens of them, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them, placed with extraordinary density and regularity. These piles, typically of older wood, which has the remarkable property of actually hardening and resisting decay when permanently submerged in water, essentially petrifying over time into something approaching stone, were driven through the unstable silt and mud of the upper layers until their pointed ends reached the firm, dense clay that lay beneath. This created a kind of underwater forest across the footprint of every building site, dense and tightly packed enough to distribute the enormous weight of masonry above across a large enough area that the clay beneath could support it. On top of these wooden pilings, the builders laid thick platforms of horizontal timber, creating a stable base layer. Only above that timber platform could stone foundations be placed. Only above the stone foundations could walls begin to rise. Every palace, every church, every bridge, every market building in Venice rested on this invisible, submerged infrastructure of wood. The city that would one day appear to float above the water with effortless elegance was, in the most literal and material sense, built on an upside-down forest buried beneath the lagoon. There is something deeply revealing about that method of construction. Venice was not founded through a single grand gesture of architectural ambition. It was built through repetition, one pile driven, then another, then another, then 10,000 more. One platform laid, one foundation poured, one course of stone placed. Practical solution upon practical solution, each one addressing an immediate problem with the resources at hand, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that would never come. It was the work of people who did not have the luxury of purity, or elegance, or patience, for anything that did not serve an immediate practical need. They had to make the impossible functional before it could ever become magnificent. The lagoon also transformed, over time, the character of the people who lived within it. Geography does not merely shape cities, it shapes habits of mind, emotional expectations, and ways of approaching the world's problems. In Venice, the environment taught its lessons every single day, with the impartial consistency of a tide that does not care about human preferences. The residents learned adaptability, because rigid, inflexible thinking breaks quickly in an environment governed by water and weather that refuse to accommodate fixed expectations. They learned to value practical skill over impressive appearance, because the lagoon rewarded genuine competence in navigation, construction, and water management, and punished incompetence with immediate and serious consequences. They learned a particular kind of watchfulness, a habit of reading subtle environmental signals, changes in the color of the water, shifts in wind direction, the behavior of birds over distant mudflats that could mean the difference between safe passage and grounding in a hidden channel. Above all, they learned to orient their lives and their ambitions not toward the land behind them, which was dangerous and contested, but toward the sea before them, which was their road, their defense, their pantry, and their possibility. Their streets were canals, their vehicles were boats. Their livelihoods increasingly depended not on fields and harvests, but on waterborne exchange, fishing, transport, and the trade in salt. Salt mattered enormously to those early communities, in ways that are difficult to appreciate from the perspective of a world where it costs almost nothing. It preserved food in an age without refrigeration, transforming the practical conditions of human nutrition and allowing the storage of protein across seasons. It was a commodity of genuine strategic importance, worth transporting over long distances and worth significant payment. The salt marshes of the lagoon could produce it in quantity, and the people of the lagoon understood how to harvest, store, and sell it. Even before Venice became the queen of long-distance Mediterranean commerce, it was learning the foundational lesson that would define its entire subsequent history, that the sea itself was not merely a place to hide from enemies, but a productive economic environment from which wealth could be drawn by those skilled and bold enough to exploit it. As the decades of the 5th century passed into the 6th and then the 7th, the scattered settlements of the lagoon gained permanence, depth, and internal complexity. Wooden structures became more substantial. Religious life, Christianity, by this point, the dominant faith of the Roman world, put down roots, with small churches appearing on the larger islands. Trade between settlements increased. Connections with the mainland, though always shadowed by the danger that had originally driven people into the lagoon, were never entirely severed. The refugees who had huddled among reeds and shifting islands did not remain merely fugitives from history. Slowly, stubbornly, and with the particular determination of people who have nothing left to lose and therefore everything to build, they began to create a new world. What a peculiar world it was, and how differently it developed from the feudal civilization crystallizing elsewhere in medieval Europe. Most medieval communities were defined by the land around them, its crops and roads, its fortifications and grazing fields, the dense local network of obligation and custom that tied peasant to lord and lord to king, through the intermediary of the soil they all depended upon. Venice was defined by the absence of almost all of that. It had no broad agricultural hinterland. This absence, rather than crippling the city, forced it toward an entirely different destiny. It had no structural reason to develop a conventional feudal society. No broad-landed aristocracy could easily dominate the marsh islands in the way that noble families dominated inland territories, because there was no land worth dominating in the familiar sense. The lagoon did not naturally produce mounted knights, castle lords, or the owners of great agricultural estates, whose wealth came from the labor of bound peasants. It produced instead boatmen and traders, craftsmen and pilots, sailors and people whose fundamental understanding of the world was organized around movement rather than possession, around connection rather than control. around the sea lane, rather than the field boundary. That distinction helps explain, more than anything else, why Venice developed so profoundly and so consistently differently from much of the medieval European world that surrounded it. While inland powers accumulated land, built castles, and organized themselves around the hierarchy of the feudal relationship, the lagoon communities looked outward toward channels, coastal routes, and eventually the open sea beyond. The sea was not an edge to them, not a boundary, marking the end of the known world. It was the center. It was their protection, their road, their food source, and their horizon of possibility, all at once. Before Venice became magnificent, before it built its Gothic palaces along the Grand Canal, before it covered St. Mark's Basilica in gold mosaic, before it launched the fleets that would make its lion symbol feared from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, it became necessary. It became, in the harshest and most practical sense of the word, a place that worked when nothing around it did. That was the foundation of everything that followed. As the scattered settlements of the lagoon slowly grew into a more coherent community through the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, a new challenge emerged, one less dramatic than fleeing from invading armies, but in the long run just as fundamental to the city's survival. The early Venetians had learned how to survive in the marshes. They had solved the engineering problem of building on unstable ground, mastered the navigational demands of the lagoon's hidden channels, and found ways to make the water around them economically productive, rather than merely protective. But practical survival in a physical environment was one challenge. Building a political community capable of governing itself through crisis, succession, ambition, and the competing interests of powerful families was quite another. If their fragile society was to endure beyond the immediate generation that had founded it, if it was to develop the kind of stability and continuity that allowed long-term investment, multi-generational commercial relationships, and the accumulation of institutional knowledge, it needed order. It needed a system of leadership strong enough to unite the islands and coordinate collective action, yet careful enough in its design not to reproduce the concentrated, arbitrary power that the refugees had originally fled to the lagoon to escape. This was not an abstract political philosophy. It was a very concrete response to a very specific historical memory. The people of the lagoon were the descendants of families that had fled from the violence and instability associated with strong men claiming personal dominion over territories and people. They had watched the Western Roman Empire fall apart as military commanders turned their power toward personal ambition. They were watching, from a relatively safe distance, as the Italian mainland was divided among competing warlords, Lombard kings, and Byzantine governors, each controlling their own territory through force of arms and the threat of violence. The last thing the Venetians wanted was to recreate that system within their own fragile, new home. And yet, community, without leadership, cannot function for long. Trade needed coordination to function across multiple islands and settlements. Disputes between families and communities required arbitration by some authority recognized as legitimate by all parties. Defense against the pirates who preyed on lagoon shipping, against the occasional mainland power that turned covetous eyes toward the wealthy trading settlements, had to be organized collectively. The answer Venice developed, over the course of several centuries of gradual political evolution, was one of the most sophisticated and durable governmental systems of the medieval world, a republic that survived in recognizable form for more than 1,000 years, outlasting every monarchy, empire, and kingdom around it. In its early centuries, Venice maintained a formal relationship with the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman world that survived from its magnificent capital at Constantinople long after the western half had collapsed. The lagoon communities were technically under Byzantine suzerainty, but Constantinople was far away, its emperors preoccupied with military and political challenges far more pressing than supervising a cluster of fishing villages in an Italian lagoon, and the practical reality of governance fell entirely on the communities themselves. The office of the Doge, from the Latin dux, meaning leader, emerged as the central institution of Venetian government, the visible head of the state that was slowly coalescing from the lagoon settlements. The first Doge is traditionally associated with the late 7th or early 8th century, though the early history of the office is partially obscured by the imperfect survival of records from that period. What is clear is that from the beginning, the Venetians designed the Doge's position with a wariness about concentrated personal power that distinguished it sharply from the monarchies and lordships of the surrounding world. The Doge was elected, not inherited. His position was granted by the leading families of the city, the wealthy merchant houses, whose fortunes were tied to commerce across the Adriatic and the wider Mediterranean, rather than descended automatically from father to son. And once elected, his authority was balanced, constrained, and monitored by numerous institutions, whose entire purpose was to prevent any single individual from accumulating enough power to threaten the Republic's collective governance. The Great Council, the Magia Consiglio, formed the foundational institution of the Venetian governmental system, composed of representatives from the noble families recognized as constituting the Venetian patriciate. It was the supreme legislative authority of the Republic, controlling elections to all significant offices, making law, and setting the framework within which all other institutions operated. In 1297, the Great Council underwent the transformation known as the serrata, the closing, in which membership was restricted to families already represented in recent councils, creating a hereditary nobility whose male members were automatically entitled to participate in the council's deliberations. This aristocratic closing fixed the boundary of political power and created the stable, self-reproducing ruling class that would govern Venice until the Republic's end in 1797. The Doge, for all his symbolic majesty and the ceremonies and rituals of Venetian state life, surrounded him with truly extraordinary theatrical magnificence, was bound hand and foot by legal and institutional constraints that would have seemed astonishing to most medieval rulers. The Promessian Ducale, the oath sworn by every new Doge before he took office, was an elaborate document enumerating in detail the restrictions placed upon him. He could not appoint his own successor. He could not allow his sons or close relatives to hold significant public offices during his reign, eliminating the possibility of using the dog-ship as a mechanism for building personal dynastic power. He could not leave the city without formal permission from the appropriate councils. He could not conduct private correspondence without state oversight. Letters addressed to the Doge were routinely opened and examined by officials before being delivered, ensuring that no private diplomatic or commercial channel developed that bypassed institutional scrutiny. He could not make significant decisions unilaterally. Every important action required consultation with and approval from appropriate councils. Even in ceremonial contexts, his role was to represent the Republic rather than to personify it as a monarch personified his kingdom. When a Doge died in office, which was the only normal way for the Dogeship to end, the state conducted an elaborate inquest into his conduct, the syndicators, to determine whether he had violated his oath in any way that would entitle the Republic to seize assets from his estate. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how seriously Venice took the principle of limiting Doge power came from the early and formative story of Doge Pietro, the fourth Candiano, who attempted in the late 10th century to use the Dogeship as a platform for building personal hereditary power on the mainland. The Venetians responded by setting fire to the Doge's palace and killing him in the flames, a decisive, violent demonstration that the Republic would not tolerate the conversion of an elected office into a monarchy, regardless of the individual's capability or status. The Council of Ten, the Consiglio dei Sei, added another dimension to the Republic's institutional architecture. Established in 1310, following the failed coup attempt of Bajamon Taipello. The Council of Ten was a permanent security committee operating with extraordinary speed, secrecy, and authority. Its mandate was to protect the state from internal threats, conspiracy, treason, and plots against the Republic, and its methods were as efficient as they were feared. The council could arrest citizens, conduct closed investigations, and impose severe penalties, including death, without the procedural delays of ordinary judicial proceedings. Its very existence was a constant reminder that the Republic would defend itself with merciless efficiency against anyone, regardless of social standing, who threatened its stability. The famous Bocche di Leone, the lion's mouth letter boxes, stone faces set into the walls of public buildings throughout the city, their open mouths forming slots through which citizens could insert anonymous written accusations, were connected to the Council of Ten and to other oversight institutions. They created an atmosphere of institutional vigilance, a permanent mechanism through which corruption, misconduct, and disloyalty could be reported without requiring the accuser to identify themselves. The accusations were reviewed, and credible ones could trigger formal investigations. The system contributed to the culture of cautious, self-monitoring civic behavior that characterized Venetian public life. This remarkable institutional architecture produced its intended result. While medieval Europe experienced the constant political turbulence of dynastic succession crises, noble rebellions, civil wars, and the violent overthrow of rulers, Venice achieved a degree of political stability that was genuinely extraordinary for the era. Between the establishment of the Dogeship in the 7th or 8th century and the Republic's end in 1797, Venice experienced remarkably few successful coups or internal political catastrophes. Individual doges might fall from power, be deposed, or face posthumous inquest. Specific council decisions might prove disastrously wrong, but the institutional framework itself endured with a continuity that no European monarchy could match. This stability was not an accident or a lucky byproduct of geography. It was the deliberate product of institutional design by people who understood, from direct historical observation, what concentrated power could do to a community. The Venetians had essentially built a political machine complex, layered, suspicious of individual ambition, and calibrated to produce collective decisions through consultation and process, rather than through the will of any single person, however capable. For the first centuries of its existence, Venice lived in the long shadow of a civilization far older, far wealthier, and far more powerful than anything the Lagoon settlements could yet claim to be. The Byzantine Empire, ruling from its incomparable capital at Constantinople, was the direct heir of the Eastern Roman tradition, and its cultural, commercial, and political influence pervaded the Mediterranean world that Venice was slowly learning to navigate. In theory, the Lagoon communities were Byzantine subjects, distant, semi-autonomous, but formally within the imperial sphere. In practice, the relationship was something far more interesting and ultimately far more consequential than simple subordination. Constantinople, in the early medieval period, was genuinely one of the wonders of the world, with a population that probably exceeded 400,000 at its peak in the Middle Byzantine period, making it by far the largest city in the Christian world. It was a center of manufacturing, scholarship, art, and commerce, whose sophistication had no parallel in contemporary Western Europe. Its markets handled goods from across the known world. Its workshops produced textiles, metalwork, jewelry, and luxury goods of extraordinary quality. Its position at the junction of Europe and Asia, controlling the Bosphorus Strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, made it the central node of the most important trade network in existence. For the merchants of Venice, whose entire economy was oriented toward maritime exchange, Constantinople was not merely an important market, it was the most important market in the world, the place where the greatest concentrations of valuable goods were assembled, and where the highest prices for luxury commodities could be obtained. The Venetian commercial relationship with Byzantium was therefore not merely economically significant. It was existentially foundational. The prosperity of the lagoon depended on access to Byzantine markets. Venetian traders had been visiting Byzantine ports since the earliest centuries of the Republic's development, and they had developed the practical skills language, familiarity with Byzantine commercial customs, knowledge of the routes and hazards of the Eastern Mediterranean, relationships with Byzantine merchants and officials that made them unusually capable intermediaries between the Byzantine commercial world and the markets of Western Europe. Venice occupied a geographic and commercial position that neither the Byzantines themselves nor most Western merchants could easily exploit. Close enough to Constantinople to maintain regular contact, yet Western enough in its orientation and connections to access the markets that lay beyond Byzantine reach. The relationship crystallized into its most consequential form in 1082, during one of those moments of acute imperial vulnerability that Byzantine history produced with disturbing regularity. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, the remarkable ruler who restored Byzantine fortunes after a period of serious crisis, was facing the aggressive expansion of the Norman adventurers who had carved out a Corsio kingdom in southern Italy and were now threatening Byzantine territories in the Balkans. He needed naval support that the empire, whose own fleet had been allowed to deteriorate through decades of neglect, could not provide from its own resources. Venice had the ships and the sailors. The agreement reached between Alexios and the Venetian Republic in 1082 produced the document that historians call the Golden Bull, Chrysabul, of that year, a golden-sealed imperial decree granting Venetian merchants trading privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire that were without precedent in their scope and generosity. Venetian traders were exempted from the customs duties and port taxes that all other foreign merchants were required to pay. They were granted the right to trade in most Byzantine ports without the commercial restrictions that normally applied to foreigners. They were given dedicated quarters in Constantinople itself, a district along the Golden Horn waterfront, complete with docks, warehouses, and commercial facilities, where the Venetian community could live, work, and conduct business under its own legal framework. The practical and economic consequences of this agreement were immediate and dramatic. Tax-free access to the richest trading system in the Mediterranean gave Venetian merchants a competitive advantage over their rivals Genoese, Pisan, Amalfitan, and Byzantine traders that translated directly into enormous profits. Goods that other merchants had to sell at prices inflated by duty payments could be offered by Venetians at lower cost, while still generating the same or greater profit. The volume of trade passing through Venetian hands expanded rapidly. The wealth flowing back to the lagoon city increased in proportion. Within a generation of the Golden Bull, the Venetian community in Constantinople had grown into a substantial and powerful commercial presence, a city within a city, several tens of thousands of people with their own churches, courts, administrators, and commercial infrastructure, dominating the trade passing through the empire's capital with a thoroughness that was both economically impressive and politically problematic. For the Byzantine Empire, the long-term consequences of the arrangement it had made in 1082 proved deeply troubling. The tax exemptions granted to Venetians were bleeding the imperial treasury of revenues that the empire desperately needed. Byzantine merchants, who had to pay the duties their Venetian competitors were exempted from, found themselves systematically undercut and marginalized in their own markets. The Venetian quarter in Constantinople grew ever more assertive, its inhabitants ever more confident in their privileged position, their manner increasingly perceived by Byzantine citizens as arrogant and presumptuous. Resentment accumulated across the 12th century, finding occasional violent expression in attacks on the Venetian community and the eruption of anti-Venetian sentiment that Byzantine officials sometimes tolerated or even encouraged. In 1171, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos made a dramatic and decisive move. he ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Venetians throughout the empire and the confiscation of their property, an action that eliminated the Venetian presence in Byzantine territory almost overnight and inflicted enormous financial losses on the Republic. Venice attempted a military response, but the expeditionary fleet was defeated by disease rather than combat, and the Republic was forced to accept the humiliation. The experience left deep scars in Venetian political memory. It demonstrated that the Republic's commercial position in the Byzantine world, however profitable in good times, rested ultimately on imperial goodwill that could be withdrawn at any moment. It hardened Venetian attitudes toward Byzantium in ways that would have dramatic and ultimately world-altering consequences when circumstances next provided an opportunity for the Republic to act on its resentments. In the year 828, two Venetian merchants named Buono da Malamaco and Rustico da Torcello experienced traders thoroughly familiar with the commercial networks of the Eastern Mediterranean, men who had sailed to Alexandria and other Muslim-controlled ports as part of the normal conduct of Venetian commerce, embarked on a mission that combined religious devotion, political calculation, and a degree of audacious cunning that the Venetians would later regard with enormous civic pride. Their destination was Alexandria, in Egypt, then under the governance of the Aghlabid dynasty of the Abbasid Caliphate. In that city lay the shrine containing the remains of Saint Mark, the evangelist, not merely a saint in the ordinary sense, but one of the four authors of the Gospels, a figure whose words and testimony formed part of the absolute bedrock of Christian scripture. According to tradition that the early Christian community had preserved, Mark had traveled widely as a missionary, founding the church at Alexandria and eventually dying there as a martyr. His remains had been kept in Alexandria for centuries, venerated by the city's Christian community and attracting pilgrims who regarded the shrine with the highest spiritual reverence. For Venice, in the late 8th and early 9th century, there were compelling reasons to desire such a relic. The city's current patron saint was Theodore of Amasia Theodoros Stratelates, in the Byzantine tradition, a military martyr whose cult was closely identified with Byzantine religious culture. As Venice was gradually distancing itself from Byzantine political control and developing its own independent civic identity, the association with a distinctly Byzantine saint felt increasingly inadequate. The Republic needed a spiritual patron of its own choosing, someone whose authority was not borrowed from Constantinople, but represented the city's independent claim to a place of honor in the Christian world. Saint Mark offered precisely what was required. His status as an evangelist placed him in the highest possible tier of Christian veneration, not merely a martyr or confessor, but one of the small number of figures whose written testimony had been incorporated into the New Testament itself. Possessing his remains would instantly elevate Venice's religious prestige to a level comparable to Rome, which claimed the bodies of Peter and Paul, and Constantinople, which had accumulated over centuries an extraordinary treasury of relics. It would transform Venice, in the eyes of the Christian world, from a commercial city into a sacred destination. The obvious obstacle was that Alexandria was under Muslim rule, and the open request for the body of a Christian saint, revered by the local Coptic Christian community, would almost certainly be refused. The only viable approach was stealth, a covert operation that the two Venetian merchants, with their commercial access to the city, were well positioned to conduct. The traditional account of what happened next has the quality of a carefully crafted story, shaped by its own retelling over centuries, but its core elements are credible in their general outlines, even if specific details may have been embellished. Buono and Rustico made contact with the custodians of the shrine men, who may themselves have been susceptible to the argument that the saint's remains would be safer in Christian hands than under Muslim governance, or who may simply have been susceptible to the commercial persuasions that Venetian merchants were practiced in deploying. The saints' remains were disinterred and placed in containers suitable for transport. The challenge of getting the containers through the customs inspection at Alexandria's port produced what became one of the most celebrated episodes in all of Venetian civic legend. Muslim customs officials who inspected departing cargo, so the story goes, were presented with a concealment strategy that exploited a fundamental element of Islamic religious law. The Venetians covered the containers holding the saints' remains with layers of pickled pork and cabbage substances that Islamic law classified as impure, contact with which devout Muslims were obligated to avoid. When the inspectors lifted the outer layers of the cargo and encountered pork, they reportedly recoiled and refused to examine the contents further, waving the shipment through without proper inspection. Whether the story in its specific details is literally accurate hardly matters historically. The relevant facts are that the remains attributed to Saint Mark arrived in Venice in 828 or shortly thereafter, and that the event produced exactly the civic transformation that the Republic's leaders had anticipated. The reception given to the relics in Venice was a moment of collective euphoria. Church bells rang across the lagoon, crowds gathered along the canals, and the body was carried through the city in solemn procession before the gathered people of the Republic. Construction of a suitable shrine began almost immediately. The first Basilica of St. Mark was built alongside the Doge's palace, a deliberate juxtaposition that made the spiritual heart of the city physically contiguous with its political center, announcing to the world the inseparability of Venetian, sacred, and civic identity. When fire damaged the original structure in 976, construction of the basilica that stands today, a magnificent synthesis of Byzantine architectural tradition, with its distinctive multiple domes, its extraordinary gold mosaic program covering the interior walls and vaults, and its rich accumulation of precious materials gathered from across the Mediterranean, began in the late 10th century and continued through the 11th. Formally consecrated in 1094, the completed basilica was unlike any church in Western Europe, deliberately and spectacularly Byzantine in its aesthetic DNA, while simultaneously asserting Venice's unique independent identity. The winged lion, the ancient symbol of Saint Mark in Christian iconographic tradition, immediately became the emblem of the Republic. It appeared on coins, on seals, on the banners of Venetian warships, and carved above the gates of every city and fortress that came under Venetian control. Wherever the lion appeared, Venetian authority was declared. The symbol traveled with the Republic's expansion across the eastern Mediterranean, and examples of it can still be found today in coastal fortresses from Istria to Cyprus, silent witnesses to the extent of Venice's maritime empire. If St. Mark's Basilica became the spiritual heart of Venice, the place where the Republic's sacred identity was proclaimed in gold mosaic and Byzantine magnificence, another, very different place served as the beating mechanical heart that made all of the Republic's power actually possible. It stood in the Castello district, in the eastern corner of the city, enclosed behind massive red brick walls, punctuated by imposing guardhouses and gates that controlled access with careful military attention. To outsiders who glimpsed it from the water, it resembled a military fortification. To Venetians, it was something far more precious than the greatest industrial complex in medieval Europe, the secret weapon that allowed a city built on mud to command one of the most formidable naval forces in the world. This was the arsenal of Venice, the arsenale, a word that passed from the Venetian Arabic, darsenar, meaning workshop, into European languages to describe any major weapons manufacturing installation, giving us a vocabulary that outlasted the institution that created it. The arsenal's origins lay in the early 12th century, when the Republic's growing commercial and military ambitions required a permanent, state-controlled facility for shipbuilding rather than dependence on private contractors. The complex expanded dramatically in the 13th and 14th centuries, eventually covering approximately 60 acres of the city's eastern edge a vast enclosed compound containing dry docks, wet docks, timber yards, rope walks, sail lofts, weapon stores, smithies, and specialized workshops for every component that a war galley or merchant vessel required. In an era long before the Industrial Revolution had given the world the concept of the factory centuries, before the assembly line, before the standardization of interchangeable parts, before the idea of mass production. Tion, as an organizing principle of manufacturing, the arsenal of Venice, operated on principles that prefigured all of these innovations with startling clarity. The key insight that made the arsenal extraordinary was the decision to move away from the medieval shipbuilding model, in which each vessel was essentially a custom project built from start to finish by a team of craftsmen in a single location, toward something fundamentally different: the systematic pre-production of standardized components that could be assembled rapidly when needed. The arsenal's workshops did not build ships. Each workshop built ship parts and built them in quantity, to consistent measurements, at consistent quality, stored in the massive warehouses that lined the compound's interior until they were needed. One building produced oars, thousands of oars, all made to standard dimensions. Another workshop produced rudders, another, masts, others, ropes, pulleys, anchors, and sails. Each component was manufactured by workers who had specialized in that particular item through years of apprenticeship within the arsenal, who knew its requirements by second nature, and who could produce it to specification with the efficiency that comes from endlessly repeated practice. When the Republic needed ships, whether for a commercial convoy to Alexandria or a war fleet to confront a Genoese challenge, the production process could begin immediately, without the delays of designing, sourcing materials, and training a workforce from scratch that would have constrained any competitor. Constructed and then floated through the arsenal's internal canal, moved progressively from station to station as specialists at each position installed the components they had mastered. By the time a hull reached the end of the assembly canal, it was a complete, equipped, ready-for-service vessel. The arsenality, the arsenal's permanent workforce, were one of the most privileged labor groups in the medieval world. As direct employees of the Republic, paid regular wages from the state treasury, they enjoyed security of employment, pension provisions, and social status that their counterparts in private workshops across Europe could not imagine. The Republic invested in them as a strategic asset, and they reciprocated with fierce loyalty. The arsenal's technical secrets were guarded with the intensity appropriate to state military intelligence, and unauthorized foreign visitors were simply not admitted to the compound. The political significance of the arsenal extended beyond its military output. By maintaining direct state control over the most critical element of Venetian military power, the Republic ensured that no private individual or family could use control of shipbuilding to accumulate the kind of leverage over the state that private military contractors have often wielded over the governments that depend on them. The arsenal was the Republic's own, answerable to the Republic's own institutions, funded from the Republic's own revenues. It was a monument to the principle that the instruments of collective power must remain under collective control. The famous demonstration of arsenal efficiency that drew the admiration of the medieval world, the story of a war galley being constructed and fully equipped in the time it took the visiting dignitary to finish his welcoming banquet, captures, even if the specific story may be apocryphal or somewhat exaggerated, a real operational reality. Venice could launch warships faster than any rival. In the crisis year of 1571, when the Holy League was assembling its fleet against the Ottoman Empire, and every available galley was urgently needed, Venice's ability to rapidly produce additional vessels from the arsenal's resources was a genuine strategic advantage that helped make the assembled fleet possible. The marriage to the sea, the Sposalizio del Mar, conducted annually on the Feast of the Ascension, was the public celebration that paired with the arsenal's industrial power to express Venice's relationship with the water. The Doge, accompanied by the Senate and the city's most distinguished figures, boarded the Bucintoro, the state's ceremonial galley, arguably the most magnificent vessel built in the medieval Mediterranean, decorated with gilded carvings, allegorical sculptures, and rich fabrics on a scale that made it less a ship than a floating architectural statement, and proceeded in a grand maritime procession across the lagoon to the Porto di Lido, where the inner waters met the open Adriatic. There, holding aloft a golden ring before the assembled fleet and the watching crowds in their boats, the Doge recited the words of the ceremony. Disponsimus te me, in signum veri perpetuique dominii. We espouse thee, O sea, as a sign of true and perpetual dominion. The ring was cast into the water. It was both prayer and proclamation, both acknowledgement of dependency and assertion of sovereignty. Venice recognized that its survival depended on the sea. The ceremony announced that the sea, in some sense, belonged to Venice in return. At the dawn of the 13th century, Europe once again stirred under the urgent voice of crusading. Pope Innocent III, one of the most energetic and politically capable popes of the entire medieval period, proclaimed a new crusade in 1198, calling for a major military expedition to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to Saladin's forces in 1187 after the Christian defeat at the Battle of Hattin. Across France and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, nobles and knights responded to the appeal. Lords gathered their forces, priests preached the spiritual rewards of the campaign, and the familiar machinery of crusade organization began to turn. But this crusade faced a fundamental logistical problem from the beginning. The proposed strategy attacking Egypt rather than Palestine directly, on the theory that Egypt was the strategic center of Muslim power in the region, and that its conquest would make Jerusalem's recovery far easier, required transporting a large army across the Mediterranean. There was only one place in the world capable of providing the necessary shipping on the required scale, within any realistic time frame, and with the navigational expertise to execute the crossing safely. That place was Venice. The envoys who arrived in Venice in 1201 to negotiate the transport agreement found a city and a doge ready to discuss the project, but prepared to set their own terms with characteristic precision. The Dandolo, who had reached a remarkable age, likely somewhere between 80 and 95, and who had been blind for years by this point, proved in the negotiations to be among the most formidably sharp political minds in the Mediterranean world. His blindness had clearly sharpened, rather than diminished, his other capacities. The terms Dandolo offered were demanding. Venice would build and supply transport for approximately 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, together with the food and fodder required for 9 months, an enormous logistical undertaking that would require the arsenal to operate at maximum capacity for an extended period, and would effectively suspend normal Venetian commercial shipping for the duration. The price was 85,000 silver marks, one of the largest single financial transactions of the 13th century. Additionally, Venice would contribute 50 armed war galleys to the expedition at its own expense, in exchange for half of all territorial conquests made during the campaign. The Republic fulfilled its side of the bargain completely. The arsenal went into full production. Timber was brought in and worked into hulls, planks, oars, and fittings. Cordage was twisted, sails cut and sewn, provisions assembled. By the summer of 1202, Venice had done what it promised. The fleet was ready, equipped, and waiting in the lagoon. The crusading army that arrived to embark was significantly smaller than the numbers that had been used to calculate the transport fee. Many knights had found alternative routes, or had simply abandoned the enterprise. The force that actually gathered in Venice was perhaps a third of the contracted number, and the money it had collected was nowhere near the 85,000 marks owed. After extensive negotiation, the assembled payment fell short by approximately 34,000 marks, a substantial deficit that placed both parties in an impossible position. Dandalo's solution was characteristically brilliant in its exploitation of the situation. Rather than simply cancelling the arrangement and absorbing the loss, he offered an alternative. The Crusaders could reduce their debt through military service. Specifically, they could help Venice recapture the port of Zadar, on the Dalmatian coast, a Venetian possession that had recently submitted to Hungarian protection before continuing eastward. The moral problem was obvious and immediately recognized by many Crusaders. Zara was a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who was himself a Crusader. Attacking it was, in any meaningful sense, an attack on fellow Christians. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade the attack. Many Crusaders refused to participate and left the expedition in protest. But the majority facing the reality that they could not continue their journey without Venetian ships, and that they had no way to pay what they owed reluctantly acquiesced. Dandolo himself, in a theatrical gesture of extraordinary political calculation, appeared in St. Mark's Basilica before the assembled Crusaders and announced that he would take the cross and join the crusade personally. The old blind doge would sail with the army. The crowd was electrified. Whether they understood that they had just witnessed a master stroke of political theatre is unclear. Zara fell after a short siege in November 1202. It was returned to Venetian control, and during the winter that the Crusaders spent in the captured city, the next and far more consequential diversion was arranged. A young Byzantine prince, named Alexios Angelos, arrived with a proposition that seemed almost miraculous in its convenience. If the Crusaders would help restore him to the Byzantine throne, his father, the legitimate Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded by his own brother. Alexios promised to pay the Crusaders' entire debt to Venice, provide them with 200,000 silver marks for the crusade, supply soldiers for the campaign, and reunite the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome. For Dandalo, the offer required very little deliberation. Constantinople was the richest city in the Christian world. Placing a friendly, deeply indebted ruler on its throne would give Venice commercial advantages of incalculable value. The fleet that had been assembled to transport Crusaders to Egypt could instead be deployed to intervene in Byzantine politics at minimal additional cost and potentially enormous profit. The first attack on Constantinople in 1203 succeeded in its immediate objective. The reigning emperor fled. Isaac II was restored, with his son Alexios IV as co-emperor. But Alexios quickly discovered that fulfilling his extravagant promises was politically impossible. The Byzantine treasury was empty, and the measures he resorted to, in order to raise money, confiscating church valuables, imposing new taxes, inflamed the Constantinople population against him. Political crisis led to coup. Alexios IV was murdered in January 1204, and the new emperor Condas V refused any negotiations with the Crusaders. The logic of the situation now pointed in only one direction. The Crusaders were owed money that the new Byzantine government refused to pay, and that could only be obtained by force. In April 1204, the combined Venetian Crusader force assaulted Constantinople for the second time, and this time, the ancient walls that had never been successfully stormed by any external enemy in nearly 9 centuries fell. What followed was 3 days of systematic looting that contemporaries described with horror: the stripping of churches, palaces, and monasteries of centuries of accumulated treasure, the destruction of artifacts that had no equivalent elsewhere in the world, the plunder of a city that had been the greatest center of art and material culture in the Christian world. The historian Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine nobleman who witnessed the sack, wrote with eloquent fury of his city's destruction. For Venice, the aftermath was carefully managed to maximize strategic advantage. The distribution of the conquered territories formalized in the Partitio Terrarum Imperia Romania of 1204 gave Venice 3/8 of the former Byzantine Empire's territories, selected with an eye toward maximum commercial and strategic value rather than maximum size. 3/8 of Constantinople itself came under Venetian influence. Key ports and islands across the Aegean were secured. And most importantly for the Republic's long-term position, Crete, the large island at the crossroads of eastern Mediterranean trade routes, was acquired, along with strategic positions in the Ionian Islands and along the Greek coastal route. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. It had been redirected by a combination of financial necessity, Venetian strategic calculation, and Byzantine political crisis into the destruction of one of the great civilizations of the medieval world. Contemporary observers and later historians have debated endlessly where the moral responsibility for that outcome lies. What is not in doubt is the result for Venice. From the most consequential naval expedition in which it had ever participated, the Republic emerged as the dominant maritime power in the eastern Mediterranean, the controller of a strategic chain of ports and islands stretching from the Adriatic to the edge of the Black Sea. In the chaotic aftermath of the sack of Constantinople, as French and other Western Crusader nobles scrambled to divide the former Byzantine territories into, say, conventional feudal kingdoms establishing themselves as dukes and princes and emperors across Greece and its islands in the familiar patterns of Western European aristocratic land, Venice was doing something entirely different, something that revealed how distinctively its leaders thought about power, wealth, and the purpose of territorial control. The Venetians had no interest in becoming a land empire. The leaders of the Republic were merchants and administrators, not feudal landlords. They had not spent 1,000 years developing the world's most sophisticated commercial, maritime network in order to settle down and govern peasant farmers in the hills of Greece. Inland territories, however extensive, offered Venice relatively little. The real value lay in something far more specific and far more deliberately chosen. Venice created what it called the Stato da Mar, the state of the sea. Rather than occupying the largest possible territories, Venetian strategists identified with great care the specific points along Mediterranean trade routes whose control would maximize commercial and strategic advantage. Ports, harbors, islands, and coastal strongholds positioned to serve as staging posts, supply depots, repair facilities, and defensive anchors for the Republic's merchant fleets. The resulting network was a triumph of strategic geography. A chain of Venetian-controlled positions stretched from the Adriatic southward and eastward across the Ionian Sea, through the Aegean, to the ports of the Levantine coast and the approaches to the Black Sea. Each position in the chain served multiple functions simultaneously, as a harbor where merchant vessels could resupply and shelter from weather, as a fortified military post whose garrison could deter piracy and challenge rival fleets, as a commercial center where local goods could be purchased for the European market and European manufactures sold to local buyers, and as an intelligence node where Venetian officials could monitor the movements of ships, armies, and political developments across the eastern Mediterranean. The crown jewel of this maritime empire was Crete. The Venetians called it the Kingdom of Candia, after the name of its principal city. The island's geographic position, at the southern edge of the Aegean Sea, on the route between the western Mediterranean and the Levantine ports, made it the single most important waypoint on the trade routes connecting Venice, spice markets of Alexandria, and the Crusader ports of the Levant. Its harbor, at Candia, modern Heraklion, was large enough to shelter substantial fleets. Its agricultural productivity, olives, wine, grain, provided supplies for passing ships and an export trade of its own. Its inland population was large enough to provide soldiers for the island's defense and labor for its commercial operations. Venice held Crete for over 4 centuries, from 1204 to 1669, when it finally fell to the Ottomans, after one of the longest and most costly sieges in military history. During those centuries, the island was the foundation of Venetian power in the eastern Mediterranean in a way that no other single possession was. Governance of the overseas territories reflected the same pragmatic intelligence that characterized Venetian administration generally. Rather than attempting to Venetianize the conquered populations, transforming Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians into Italian-speaking Latin Catholics through cultural suppression, Venice generally allowed local populations to maintain their language, religion, and customary practices, as long as those practices did not interfere with the Republic's essential commercial and fiscal interests. This approach was not driven by any theoretical commitment to cultural pluralism. It was simply more efficient than attempting to impose uniformity on populations that would resist it. The administrative model was carefully standardized. Governors, rhetori, were drawn from the Venetian nobility and served fixed terms, after which they were required to return to Venice and submit to review of their conduct by the Syndici auditors, who assessed whether they had fulfilled their responsibilities properly. Rotation of officials prevented the development of local power bases that might develop independent ambitions. The system was designed to keep the overseas territories firmly integrated into the Republic's administrative and fiscal framework rather than allowing them to develop into autonomous principalities. The wealth generated by this maritime empire was staggering. The commercial flows passing through Venetian-controlled ports during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries made the Republic one of the richest states in Europe, perhaps the richest per capita. The customs revenues alone from the movement of spices, silks, textiles, and other luxury goods through Venetian-controlled harbors financed the magnificent building programs that transformed the city on the Lagoon, the Gothic palaces along the Grand Canal, the Doge's Palace, the expansion and decoration of St. Mark's, and the maintenance of the arsenal that kept the whole system militarily viable. Among the hundreds of Venetian merchant families whose commercial networks extended across the Mediterranean and into the markets of the Middle East, one family, in the latter half of the 13th century, pushed that ambition to an extreme that had no precedent, traveling not merely to the familiar ports of Egypt and the Levant, but overland through Central Asia to the court of the Mongol Great Khan of China itself. The story of the Polo family, and particularly of young Marco Polo, became the most celebrated illustration of Venetian commercial curiosity and geographic reach in the entire Middle Ages. Marco Polo was born in Venice around 1254, into a family that was already deeply engaged in long-distance Eastern trade. His father Niccolo and his uncle Maffi had completed a remarkable journey eastward before Marco was born, reaching the court of Kublai Khan in China, where they had been received with imperial hospitality and had returned to Venice in 1269, carrying a request from the Khan for Christian missionaries and various Western goods. In 1271, when Marco was approximately 17 years old, the family set out eastward again, this time with the young Marco included in the traveling party. The journey that followed lasted approximately 3.5 years. The route led through Acre, in the Crusader-era Levant, across Anatolia, through Persia, over the high Pamir Mountains that separated the known world of the Middle East from the unknown world of Central Asia beyond, and then across the vast expanses of the Gobi Desert to the Chinese heartland of Kublai Khan's empire. The hardships were continuous extreme altitude in the mountain crossings, extreme heat and cold in the desert passages, disease, the persistent danger of bandits along stretches of the route where imperial protection was thin or absent. When the Polos finally reached the Khan's court, probably in 1275, they encountered a ruler and a civilization that exceeded anything their Venetian experience had prepared them for. Kublai Khan's China was, by virtually every quantifiable measure of urban development, administrative sophistication, and material wealth, the most advanced civilization on Earth. The cities Marco later described Qincy, Hangzhou, Quincy and others had populations that dwarfed any European city of the period. The administrative systems supporting them sophisticated bureaucratic structures, paper currency backed by state authority, an imperial postal relay system, the YAM, that allowed messages to travel across thousands of miles with extraordinary speed, operated at a scale and with a precision that had no Western parallel. Kublai Khan showed considerable interest in the Venetians, and Marco in particular seems to have impressed him as an observant, capable, and diplomatically skillful young man. He was deployed on administrative missions across the empire, serving as a kind of fact-finding representative whose reports on conditions in distant provinces were valued by the imperial court. This gave him direct personal experience of regions and practices that no previous European traveler had described. The return journey, completed around 1295, after approximately 24 years of absence, brought the Polos home by sea through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, around the southern coast of Arabia, and eventually through Persia to the Black Sea, and then to Venice. The legend of their return, the worn and strange-seeming travelers, unrecognized by their own relatives, until they cut open the seams of their traveling clothes to reveal the precious stones hidden within captures in theatrical form, the genuine reality of how completely 24 years in Asia had transformed them in ways that the Venice they had left could barely accommodate. The book that recorded Marco's experiences, compiled during his imprisonment in Genoa following his capture at the naval battle of Cazzola in 1298, dictated to a fellow prisoner named Rustichello da Pisa, who gave the raw material of Marco's car. Recollections, a literary form, became one of the most influential documents in the history of European exploration. The Dévissement du Monde, variably titled in different manuscript traditions, most often called The Travels of Marco Polo, circulated in hundreds of manuscript copies across Europe in numerous languages, reaching audiences far beyond the merchant and scholarly circles that first encountered it. Its accounts of Chinese cities, with populations far exceeding anything in Europe, of paper money as a functional currency, an idea incomprehensible to contemporaries in a world where money meant metal, of coal as a fuel, the mysterious black stones burned across northern China, of an imperial postal system capable of transmitting messages thousands of miles in days rather than months, of spices and silks and precious stones available in quantities that made the trickle reaching European markets through multiple intermediaries seem pitiful by comparison. All of this was received by European readers with a mixture of fascination and skepticism that has characterized the book's reception ever since. Christopher Columbus, studying his copy of Marco Polo's travels before his first Atlantic voyage in 1492, annotated the margins with notes indicating the passages he found particularly relevant to his own aspirations. The Venetian merchants' descriptions of the wealth of Asia contributed directly to the mental framework within which Columbus planned and understood his expedition, though the continent he actually encountered was not the one Marco had described. By the late 14th century, the central fact of Mediterranean commercial life was the rivalry between two great republics that had more in common with each other than with any other state in Europe, and who were precisely for that reason locked in a competition that neither could easily afford to lose. Venice, rising from its Adriatic lagoon, and Genoa, carved into the steep Ligurian coast of northwestern Italy, were both merchant republics governed by commercial elites. Both had built maritime empires of strategic ports and trade routes across the Mediterranean. Both had invested enormously in their naval capacity. Both understood, with the clarity of people whose entire existence depended on it, that control of the Mediterranean trade routes was the difference between prosperity and ruin. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa had smoldered and occasionally exploded into open conflict across the 13th and 14th centuries. There were naval battles in the Adriatic and the Aegean, trade wars conducted through diplomatic manipulation and commercial pressure. and fierce competition in the markets of Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Black Sea, particularly in the trade with the Mongol Empire through the Crimean port of Kaffa, which the Genoese controlled, and the Venetian colonies of the Aegean, from which Venice contested Genoese dominance of the Black Sea trade. The War of Chioggia, 1378 to 1381, was the conflict that finally pushed the rivalry to its existential extreme. In 1379, the Genoese fleet, commanded with bold strategic clarity by an admiral who understood fundamental vulnerability in Venice's seemingly impregnable defensive position, executed the maneuver that no enemy had previously dared attempt. Rather than engaging Venetian naval forces in the open Adriatic, where Venetian experience and home water advantage would favor the defense, the Genoese pushed directly into the lagoon itself. They captured the port of Chioggia at the southern entrance to the lagoon, establishing a military base from which they could blockade Venice's access to the sea. The panic that swept through Venice when Genoese ships were confirmed to be inside the lagoon was unlike anything the city had experienced since its earliest centuries. The lagoon had been Venice's ultimate defense for 1,000 years, the natural fortress that had made the city unconquerable by any force that depended on horses or heavy infantry. Now, enemy ships rode at anchor within it, within sight of the city's towers and domes. The Genoese admiral's boast that he would soon bridle the horses of St. Mark, physically removing from the Basilica's facade. The famous bronze horses, looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, seemed less like arrogance than a realistic statement of intent. The Venetian response to this crisis revealed the character that 1,000 years of survival had built into the Republic's institutions and its people. The Great Council met in emergency session. The Republic mobilized every available resource, requisitioning merchant ships for conversion to warships, taxing wealthy families to fund emergency military spending, releasing prisoners who agreed to serve, and, most importantly, making the decision to restore to command a military leader who had previously been imprisoned following an earlier naval defeat. That leader was Vetta Pisani, a naval commander of genuine ability who had been made the scapegoat for an earlier setback and imprisoned by the Venetian government with the harsh accountability that the Republic applied to military failure. His restoration to command in the crisis of 1379 reflected both his genuine capability and the Republic's pragmatic willingness to prioritize effectiveness over precedent. Pisani was released, given command, and immediately began devising the strategy that would save the Republic. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the Genoese fleet in its fortified position inside Chioggia's harbor, a frontal attack that would have been suicidal against an entrenched force, Pisani conceived and executed what may be the most strategically elegant defensive maneuver in Venetian military history. Under cover of darkness, Venetian crews moved through the lagoon's channels, loaded their oldest and least valuable ships with stones and other heavy materials, and systematically sank them in the narrow channel entrances that had allowed the Genoese fleet to enter Chioggia. One after another, the waterways that connected the captured port to the open sea were blocked by sunken vessels. The Genoese fleet that had entered the lagoon expecting to capture Venice found itself trapped instead. The blockadors had become the blockador. Their supply lines were cut. Food supplies aboard the confined fleet began to run out. The concentrated force that had seemed so threatening was revealed to be dependent on free movement that it no longer had. Venetian ships positioned outside the blockaded harbor prevented any resupply from the sea, while Venetian forces controlled the lagoon passages that might have allowed escape by another route. For months, the siege continued. The Genoese crew conditions deteriorated from cramped and uncomfortable to genuinely desperate. Disease spread. Starvation loomed. Attempts to break through the blocked channels failed. The Genoese commander Luciano Doria had been killed early in the conflict, removing the most capable leadership the enemy possessed. By the summer of 1380, the trapped fleet had no remaining option. On June 24th, 1380. The Genoese forces at Chioggia surrendered. The fleet that had come within sight of capturing Venice was itself captured. The War of Chioggia was effectively over, and Venice had won it by transforming a desperate defensive situation into a strategic trap through the application of precisely the kind of practical ingenuity that the Lagoon environment had spent 1,000 years training into the Venetian character. The aftermath of Chioggia settled the fundamental question of Mediterranean naval supremacy for generations. Genoa, though it survived as an important financial center and trading city, never again posed a comparable military challenge to Venice on the sea. Venice emerged from the war battered but dominant, the unchallenged maritime power of the Mediterranean, poised to enter the greatest century of its commercial prosperity. By the late 14th and throughout the 15th centuries, Venice stood at the commercial center of the known world, a position built not through luck or natural resources, cosa sos advantage, but through 5 centuries of deliberate strategic positioning along the routes by which the most valuable commodities on earth moved from their places of origin to their markets of consumption. At the heart of this commercial empire was the spice trade, a set of commodities whose significance to the medieval and early modern economy it is almost impossible to exaggerate from the perspective of a world where peppercorns cost pennies and nutmeg is a spice rack afterthought. In the 14th and 15th centuries, spices pepper from the Malabar coast of India, cinnamon from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, cloves from the Molucca of what is now Indonesia, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, ginger from various Asian sources were among the most valuable commodities traded anywhere on earth, worth sums that placed them in the same economic category as gold and silk. Their importance derived from multiple, overlapping functions. They preserved meat and other foods in an age entirely without refrigeration, allowing proteins to remain edible across weeks and months of storage or transport that would otherwise render them inedible. They masked or corrected the flavors of foods that had begun to deteriorate without being fully spoiled, a distinction of practical importance when the alternative to eating questionable food was going hungry. They served as essential ingredients in the pharmaceutical pharmacopoeia of the period, with virtually every significant medicinal compound of medieval medicine containing at least one spice ingredient, and they functioned as powerful markers of social status and wealth. To serve dishes heavily seasoned with rare spices was to announce, without words, that one possessed the means to afford what most could not, a form of conspicuous consumption that drove demand among the elites of every European court and great household. The geographic origin of spices in the tropical regions of South and Southeast Asia meant that they had to travel enormous distances to reach European markets, and every stage of that journey added cost and profit for those who controlled it. Arab and Indian merchant networks dominated the trade within the Indian Ocean system, carrying spices from their production areas in the Spice Islands and the Malabar coast across the ocean to the ports of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. From those terminal ports, overland caravan routes carried the goods westward across Arabia and Persia to the great entrepot cities of the Fatih Entrepot, cities of the Levantine coast, principally Alexandria in Egypt and Aleppo in Syria, where Mediterranean commercial networks took over. It was at these Mediterranean endpoints that Venice had positioned itself with maximum strategic advantage. The Republic maintained permanent commercial communities in Alexandria and Beirut, with the elaborate diplomatic relationships with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt and the other Muslim powers of the Levantine coast that were necessary to sustain commercial access despite the religious divide between Christian Venice and Islamic Egypt. Venetian diplomats were among the most skilled in Europe at navigating the intersection of commercial necessity and religious tension, and the Republic's pragmatic willingness to prioritize trade over crusading ideology had repeatedly secured it commercial advantages that more rigidly orthodox rulers could not obtain. The Venetian Mude system, the organized convoys of state-controlled galleys that transported goods between Venice and its major trading partners on regular seasonal schedules, was a marvel of commercial logistics. The Republic organized the sailings of its great merchant galleys to Alexandria, Beirut, the Black Sea, Flanders, England, and other destinations as a formal state enterprise, auctioning off cargo space on each convoy to the highest bidders among Venetian merchants, providing armed escorts that protected against piracy, and setting standardized route schedules that the entire commercial community could plan around. The reliability of the system, the knowledge that a muder would sail to Alexandria in the spring and return in the fall every year with the cargo spaces allocated in advance, was itself a commercial asset, allowing merchants to make commitments and plan supply chains with a confidence that informal shipping arrangements could never provide. The profits generated by this system were the financial foundation on which the golden age of Venice rested. The Rialto, the commercial heart of the city, the district of warehouses, counting houses, banks, and markets centered on the bridge across the Grand Canal, was the physical space where this wealth was concentrated, calculated, and redistributed. Money changers, merchant bankers, commodity brokers, insurance agents, and notaries who specialized in commercial contracts filled the streets around the Rialto market. The financial innovations that Venetian and other Italian merchants developed to manage the risks and capital requirements of long-distance trade, marine insurance, bills of exchange, partnership contracts, colleganza, and commenda arrangements, sophisticated double-entry bookkeeping, were the intellectual foundations of the modern financial system. The word bank itself comes from the Italian banco, the bench or table at which money changers sat to conduct their business. The word bankrupt comes from the practice of breaking the money changer's bench when he could no longer meet his obligations. The practical terminology of modern finance was largely created by the merchant communities of medieval Italian cities, with Venice among the most important contributors. The capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II on May 29, 1453, was one of the most consequential single events of the 15th century, a moment that genuinely marked, as historians would later say, the end of the medieval world and the beginning of something new. For Venice, whose commercial relationships with Constantinople stretched back centuries, and whose position as the dominant maritime power of the Eastern Mediterranean depended significantly on its ability to operate freely in waters now coming under Ottoman control. The fall of the city was both a cultural shock and a strategic alarm of the highest order. Mehmed the Conqueror, as his own tradition remembered him, had conducted the final siege with the combination of military innovation and sheer strategic persistence that characterized Ottoman expansion at its peak. The great chain across the Golden Horn that had previously prevented naval access to the harbor was bypassed by the audacious expedient of dragging Ottoman ships overland across the Galata Peninsula and relaunching them inside the harbor. The massive bombards, capable of firing stone cannonballs weighing hundreds of pounds, manufactured under the direction of the Hungarian engineer Herben, battered the land walls that had withstood every previous assault for over 1,000 years. After 53 days of siege, the walls were breached and the city fell. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome that had survived for 1,000 years after the Western Empire's collapse, was gone. A new and extraordinarily capable empire now controlled the junction point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the position that had always been central to the commercial geography of the entire region. Venice's response to this reality was characteristically pragmatic. The Republic sent ambassadors to negotiate commercial arrangements with the new Ottoman government almost immediately after the conquest, setting aside the Christian solidarity rhetoric that might have prevented such contacts, in favor of the mercantile realism that was Venice's most consistent political instinct. Trade agreements were reached. Venetian merchants continued operating in Constantinople, now called Istanbul, under Ottoman rule. The commercial relationship, though changed in its political context, persisted. But the long-term trajectory of Ottoman expansion was a threat to Venetian interests that no amount of diplomatic finesse could entirely neutralize. As the Ottomans expanded westward through the Balkans and southward through Anatolia and eventually across the Levant, they brought under their control, one by one, the ports and strategic positions that formed the links in Venice's maritime chain. Islands in the Aegean that had been Venetian possessions for centuries came under attack. Fortified ports along the Greek coast that had served as staging posts for Venetian merchant convoys were besieged and captured. The invasion of Cyprus in 1570 by a massive Ottoman force brought the conflict to a crisis. Cyprus, the largest island under Venetian control and one of the most strategically important positions in the eastern Mediterranean, fell after a brutal campaign that included the prolonged siege of Famagusta, the last Venetian stronghold, defended with legendary courage by its governor Marcantonio Bragadin, until the city was finally forced to surrender in August 1571. Bragadin's subsequent torture and execution by the Ottoman commander, he was flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy, before eventually being recovered and returned to Venice, where it rests today in a monument in the Basilica dei Santi Giovanni e Paolo, became a symbol of the brutal stakes of the Ottoman-Venetian conflict. The formation of the Holy League of 1571, bringing together Venice, Spain, the papacy, Genoa, and several smaller Italian states, under the supreme command of Don Juan of Austria, half-brother of Philip II of Spain, produced the most dramatic single engagement of the Ottoman-Venetian conflict. At the Battle of Lepanto, on October 7, 1571, in the Gulf of Patras, off the western coast of Greece, the largest naval battle fought in European waters since the ancient world decided the fate of the eastern Mediterranean. The Holy League fleet comprised approximately 212 galleys and 6 of Venice's revolutionary galasses, large, heavily armed hybrid vessels that combined the rowing capability of galleys with a substantial battery of artillery mounted along their sides. The galasses were positioned in front of the main fleet, their role being to disrupt the Ottoman formation with artillery fire before the main clash of the galleys. The Ottoman fleet, under Ali Pasha, Muezzin Zaid Ali Pasha, numbered approximately 222 galleys. When the fleets met, the Venetian galasses unleashed artillery fire that killed thousands of Ottoman soldiers and sailors and shattered the coherence of the Ottoman formation before the main engagement began. In the confused, violent melee that followed, hundreds of galleys, ramming, grappling, and boarding one another across miles of sea, the Holy League gradually gained the upper hand. Ali Pasha was killed during the fighting. His flagship was captured. By the end of the afternoon, the Ottoman fleet had been destroyed or captured, approximately 200 Ottoman galleys taken or sunk, compared to approximately 17 League vessels lost. Approximately 15,000 Christian galley slaves were freed from the Ottoman oar benches. The celebrations across Europe were enormous. Church bells rang from Madrid to Vienna. The Pope ordered the establishment of a new feast day, Our Lady of the Rosary, to commemorate the victory. Miguel de Cervantes, who fought at Lepanto as a Spanish infantry soldier and was wounded in the battle, losing the use of his left hand, later called it the greatest occasion that the past or present ages have seen. Yet the diplomatic aftermath was bittersweet for Venice. The Holy League dissolved within months as its constituent members returned to their competing interests. Spain, focused on its Atlantic empire and its European dynastic commitments, had little desire to sustain a Mediterranean crusade. Without Spain's resources, Venice could not continue the war alone. In 1573, Venice negotiated a separate peace, with the Ottomans surrendering Cyprus permanently and paying a war indemnity. The magnificent victory at Lepanto had not altered the fundamental strategic reality. The eastern Mediterranean was slipping gradually out of Venice's commercial grasp. The terra firma expansion. Venice's decision in the early 15th century to extend its power from the Lagoon onto the Italian mainland reflected both the opportunities created by the fractured Italian political landscape and the defensive logic of securing the city's supply lines. Through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and strategic purchase, Venice incorporated Padua, 1405, Vicenza, 1404, Verona, 1405, Udine, 1420, Brescia, 1426, and Bergamo, 1428, into a mainland domain that stretched from the edge of the lagoon westward almost to Milan and northward toward the Alps. This expansion made Venice a dual power simultaneously, a maritime empire in the east and a core, significant territorial state in northern Italy, with all the complications that dual identity entailed. Governing agricultural territories required different administrative skills and different military instruments than governing a chain of overseas ports. The Republic adapted by developing an elaborate system of mainland governance, with provveditori, administrators, and other officials managing the different cities and territories, and by hiring condottieri, mercenary commanders, to provide the land military force that Venice's own citizens had never developed. The story of the condottiere Francesco Busone da Carmagnola illustrates the Republic's vigilant paranoia about military power. Having served Venice brilliantly against Milan and achieved a celebrity status that made the Venetian government uncomfortable, Carmagnola was summoned to Venice in 1432 under the pretense of strategic consultation. He was arrested on arrival, tried in secret by the Council of Ten on charges of treason, the evidence suggesting he had been taking bribes from Milan and deliberately avoiding decisive victories, and executed between the columns of the Piazzetta in 1432. Whatever the specific truth of the charges, the episode sent an unmistakable message about the Republic's priorities. No military commander, however successful, would be permitted to accumulate personal power that could threaten institutional control. For centuries, Venice's commercial power had rested on a geographic fact that seemed as permanent as the Alps themselves. The eastern Mediterranean was the only practical route by which the spices, silks, and luxury goods of Asia could reach the markets of Europe. Venice sat at the western end of this route, in a position of extraordinary strategic advantage that it had spent generations reinforcing through diplomatic relationships, commercial expertise, and naval power. The system was extraordinarily profitable. It was also, as the Portuguese were about to demonstrate, not as permanent as it appears. Paired. The Portuguese exploration of the African coast that began under the patronage of Prince Henry, the navigator in the early 15th century, was driven by a combination of motives: the desire to find a direct route to the spice markets of Asia that would bypass the Muslim intermediaries controlling the overland routes, the ambition to spread Christianity to unknown peoples encountered along the way, and the more straightforward commercial aspiration to access the gold trade of West Africa that the trans-Saharan caravan routes had hitherto monopolized. The project was systematic and patient, with each successive voyage pushing the known southern boundary of the African coastline further south, with the accumulated navigational knowledge of each expedition informing the planning of the next. The design of the caravel, the small, highly maneuverable deep ocean sailing vessel with triangular latane sails that could make progress against contrary winds in ways that the traditional square-rigged vessels of Mediterranean navigation could not give Portuguese sailors a technical instrument suited to the challenges of Atlantic Ocean going that their predecessors had lacked. Caravel could beat to windward, could sail in rougher sea conditions than Mediterranean galleys, and required smaller crews relative to its cargo capacity than oar-powered vessels. Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, demonstrating for the first time that the African continent had a southern end that could be navigated around, that the Indian Ocean was accessible from the Atlantic. The breakthrough transformed the Portuguese program from hypothesis to achievement. A direct sea route from Europe to India was no longer a theoretical possibility, but a demonstrated practical reality waiting to be fully exploited. Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India, 1497 to 1499, completed the project. 4 ships departed Lisbon in July 1497. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope and navigating the East African coast, where Portuguese sailors benefited enormously from the navigational Beni, knowledge of Arab and Swahili pilots, familiar with the Indian Ocean's seasonal monsoon wind patterns, da Gama's fleet arrived at Calicut, Kozhikode, on the Malabar coast of India, in May 1498. They had reached the pepper and spice markets directly, without crossing any Muslim-controlled territory, without passing through any of the commercial networks that funneled spices through the Middle East and into Venetian hands. When news of da Gama's success reached Venice, probably in 1499, as the first reports filtered back from Portugal, the reaction of the Republic's merchants and officials was one of barely suppressed alarm. The Venetian diarist Girolamo Priuli recorded the response with memorable directness. "The discovery of the sea route to India," he wrote, "was the worst news that could ever come to Venice." He understood with clarity exactly what it meant. The geographic advantage that had made Venice indispensable as the gateway between East and West was in the process of being eliminated. Portuguese ships that could bypass the entire Mediterranean system, purchasing spices directly from Indian producers and sailing directly back to Lisbon, could offer those goods to European markets at prices that Mediterranean supply chains, with their multiple stages of transport and their multiple layers of intermediary profit, could not compete with. Venetian responses to the Portuguese threat were varied and ultimately unsuccessful. Diplomatic overtures to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, suggesting that the Mamluk Ottoman Venetian commercial system that funneled Asian trade through the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean had common interests in resisting Portuguese penetration of the Indian Ocean, produced some sympathetic responses, but no effective collective counter-strategy. A Venetian-Egyptian fleet sent into the Indian Ocean was defeated by Portuguese forces at the Battle of Chaul in 1508. The visionary proposal for a canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, which would have allowed Venetian ships to access the Indian Ocean directly without circumnavigating Africa, was recognized as technically beyond the engineering capacity of the era. By the first decade of the 16th century, the structural reality was becoming undeniable. Portuguese Lisbon was emerging as the new western terminal of the Asian spice trade, replacing Venice in the role that the Lagoon city had occupied for centuries. Dutch and English commercial networks would follow Portuguese routes, building their own direct-access Asian commercial systems. The center of gravity of world trade was shifting from the enclosed Mediterranean to the open Atlantic, from the eastern routes that Venice dominated to the ocean highways that its geographic position on a coastal lagoon made it structurally unable to exploit. Venice did not collapse. The city's accumulated wealth was enormous, its financial sophistication unmatched, its cultural life still at a peak, but its commercial dominance over the spice trade, the engine of its wealth, for centuries was being systematically eroded by forces that no amount of diplomatic skill or military effort could ultimately reverse. As Venice's political and commercial power gradually declined through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the city underwent a remarkable transformation. If it could no longer dominate the world as a maritime commercial empire, it would become something else, entirely perhaps, the most culturally vivid and artistically fertile city in Europe, a destination that attracted artists, musicians, writers, and travelers from across the continent who came to experience a civilization that seemed to have translated its centuries of wealth and cosmopolitan engagement with the world into an extraordinary concentration of beauty and creative energy. The visual arts of Venice had been developing their distinctive character since the Byzantine-influenced mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica. But the Renaissance brought them to a flowering that has few parallels in Western art history. Giovanni Bellini, who Domi, Condar, dated Venetian painting in the later 15th century, developed the use of oil paint in ways that gave Venetian work its characteristic quality of luminous color and atmospheric depth, qualities perfectly suited to capturing the particular quality of light in a city surrounded by water that reflects and scatters illumination in ways that inland cities cannot match. His students, Giorgione and the young Titian, would carry this tradition to its supreme expression. Titian, Tiziano Vecellio, born around 1488 near Pieve di Cadore, in the Dolomites, and active in Venice for most of his extraordinary long career, died in 1576 at an age that may have been close to 90, and his output across those decades encompassed portraiture, mythology, religious subjects, and historical allegory in a body of work that defined what painting could achieve. His portraits of Charles V, Philip II, Francis I, and Pope Paul III were not merely likenesses, but psychological investigations of power that remain among the most penetrating images of 16th-century European governance ever created. His mythological paintings, the Venus of Urbino, the Rape of Europa, the Bacchanals painted for Alfonso d'Este, explored the sensory and emotional possibilities of paint with a freedom and depth that subsequent artists have spent centuries studying and responding to. Alongside Titian, Jacopo Tintoretto, 1518 to 1594, brought to Venetian painting a dramatic intensity and compositional boldness that anticipated the Baroque, while Paolo Veronese, 1528 to 1588, populated enormous canvases with the opulent festivity of Venetian patrician life, in works that are simultaneously celebrations of wealth and masterclasses in compositional organization. The painting of Venice in the 16th century collectively represents one of the great moments of Western visual art, comparable in its concentration of genius and achievement to Renaissance Florence, with a character distinctly its own. Music flourished with comparable richness. The Basilica of St. Mark's, with its unique architectural configuration of two facing organ lofts and ample space for the placement of musical forces in multiple separated locations, developed a distinctive musical style known as the Venetian polychoral tradition music for multiple choirs or instrumental groups positioned in different parts of the building, creating effects of spatial sound that exploited the building's acoustic properties in unprecedented ways. The composers Giovanni Gabrieli and his uncle Andrea Gabrieli developed this tradition into some of the most impressive ceremonial music of the late Renaissance. Their canzonas, motets, and sacred symphonies filling the golden interior of the basilica with layered, echoing sound that seemed to embody the physical experience of being surrounded by Byzantine magnificence. Antonio Vivaldi, 1678 to 1741, represents the apex of Venetian Baroque music, a composer whose output was extraordinary in both quantity and quality, and whose influence on the development of the instrumental concerto established forms and approaches that shaped Western music for a century after his death. His best-known work, Le Quattro Stagioni, The Four Seasons, published 1725, 4 violin concertos, each accompanied by a descriptive sonnet, depicting the sensory and atmospheric character of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, demonstrated what the genre could achieve when put in the service of vivid descriptive imagination. The work remains one of the most frequently performed pieces of classical music ever written. Vivaldi served for most of his career as a teacher and composer at the Ospedale della Pieta, one of Venice's 4 ospedali, institutions that housed and educated orphaned, illegitimate, or abandoned girls and trained many of them to exceptional levels of musical accomplishment. The Pieta's orchestra and choir became famous throughout Europe, attracting visitors who came specifically to hear the performances by these young women of music, composed for them by Vivaldi. His relationship with the institution was long and productive. He was repeatedly hired, occasionally dismissed, and repeatedly rehired, and the compositions he wrote for the Pietà's forces represent some of the most inventive and technically demanding concertante music of the Baroque era. The architectural identity of Venice was shaped in the 16th century, primarily by the work of Andrea Palladio, 1508 to 1580, whose brilliantly rational application of ancient Roman architectural principles to the design of churches, villas, and public buildings created an aesthetic so clear, so harmonious, and so widely applicable that it became the dominant influence on Western architecture for 2 centuries. After his death, the Palladian tradition that shaped country houses in England, plantation houses in Virginia, and public buildings across the world. His 2 great churches in Venice, San Giorgio Maggiore, begun 1566, and Il Redenta, begun 1577, stand across the water from the main island and the Zata respectively. Their white stone facades and precisely proportioned classical elements creating visual dialogues with the Gothic and Byzantine buildings across the canals that are among the most satisfying moments in all of European cityscape. The Carnival of Venice. The Carnival was the expression of this culture of spectacle taken to its most democratic and intoxicating extreme. The festival, which in its greatest centuries extended from the day after Christmas until the beginning of Lent, Shrove Tuesday, was one of the defining social institutions of the Republic, a sanctioned period of social inversion, theatrical fantasy, and communal celebration in which the normal hierarchies and constraints of Venetian life were temporarily suspended, or at least obscured. The Masque, the Borta, the Moretta, the Medico della Peste, the Zanni, and dozens of other traditional forms was the enabling technology of carnival freedom. Behind a mask, social identity was concealed. A nobleman could walk beside a servant without either being identified. A woman could move through public spaces with a freedom that normal social convention denied her. A foreigner could be indistinguishable from a citizen. The social theatre of Venice, a city that had always been intensely conscious of rank, reputation, and the visible marks of status, temporarily dissolved into a democracy of mystery. The 1562 law, requiring that gondolas be painted black, the sumptuary regulation that standardized the most visible symbol of chaos. Venetian life was itself an expression of this characteristically Venetian tension between public equality and private luxury. Noble families had been competing to display their wealth through ever more extravagantly decorated gondolas, threatening to make the canals into exhibits of aristocratic ostentation. The Republic's response was to regulate the display to enforce a visual uniformity on the water that preserved the fiction of civic equality, while doing nothing to prevent private wealth from expressing itself behind the shuttered windows of the palaces. The Ridotto, established by the Venetian government in 1638 as the world's first state-sanctioned gambling establishment, operated in the Palazzo Dandalo near San Moise and attracted visitors from across Europe who came to Venice specifically for the combination of gaming, masked, anonymity, and social freedom that no other city offered. Gambling had always been popular in Venice, but the Ridotto represented the Republic's characteristic response to an activity it could not suppress, regulate it, tax it, control its environment, and benefit from the revenue. The Venetian Republic that Napoleon Bonaparte encountered in 1796 and 1797 was, in its external appearance, still magnificent, still the most beautiful city in Europe, still capable of the elaborate ceremonial grandeur that had always been one of its most effective political tools. But the internal reality was very different. The institutions that had governed Venice for 1,000 years had grown rigid, conservative, and increasingly ineffective. The pool of noble families participating in the Great Council had shrunk through centuries of plague, emigration, and biological extinction. The financial resources that had once funded grand strategic initiatives had been depleted by the costs of the Ottoman Wars, particularly the Canadian War, 1645 to 1669, that ended with the loss of Crete after more than 2 decades of extraordinarily costly fighting. The mainland empire that had provided agricultural revenue and strategic depth was increasingly dependent on external protection rather than Venetian military force. Napoleon's Italian campaign of 1796 to 1796 to 1797 swept aside Austrian power in northern Italy with a speed and decisiveness that astonished contemporaries. The young general's combination of rapid tactical movement, concentration of force at decisive points, and willingness to exploit the political and psychological dimensions of military success created a series of victories that left the traditional Italian political order in ruins. The Papal States, the Duchy of Milan, Modena, and numerous smaller principalities all found themselves unable to resist the momentum of the French revolutionary armies. Venice attempted neutrality, the traditional Venetian response to conflicts between external powers that threatened to sweep through the Italian peninsula. For centuries, the Republic's careful diplomatic positioning, its willingness to maintain workable relationships with all sides of major conflicts, and the natural protection of its lagoon had allowed it to survive situations that destroyed more inflexible or more obviously committed states. But Napoleon's grievances against Venice, whether genuine or fabricated as a pretext for action, proved immune to Venetian diplomatic finesse. The immediate trigger was an uprising in Verona on April 17, 1797, the Vive Contes Easter Pasque Veronese, in which Venetian subjects, outraged by French military excesses and encouraged by local Venetian officials, attacked French troops quartered in the city, killing several hundred. Napoleon declared this an act of war by the Venetian Republic against France. Whether the uprising was spontaneous, organized, or deliberately provoked to provide Napoleon with the pretext he needed for action, that he intended anyway, is debated by historians. What is certain is that Napoleon used it with ruthless political efficiency, facing demands that included disarmament, occupation, and fundamental transformation of the Republic's governmental structure. The Venetian Great Council met for its final session on May 12, 1797. The debate was desperate and brief. The city had no effective military force. The last significant Venetian fleet had been reduced to a corsa. The arsenal that had once launched warships to challenge Ottoman and Genoese power was a fraction of its former capacity. French troops were on the mainland. Napoleon had threatened bombardment. The motion before the Great Council was to accept the French terms, which effectively meant the dissolution of the Republic and its replacement by a provisional municipality acceptable to France. The vote was 512 in favor, 20 against, with 5 abstentions. The required quorum of 600 members was barely present. Accounts suggest that many eligible members had simply not appeared, unwilling to participate in the act of dissolution, but equally unwilling to vote against the inevitable. Ludovico Manin, the last Doge of Venice, a man who had held office for a decade without particular distinction and who would be remembered primarily for the role history assigned him, reportedly removed the cornered ducal cap from his head and handed it to his servant with the words, "Take it, I shall not need it again." Whether the story is literally accurate or elaborated in subsequent tellings, it captures the emotional reality of the moment. French troops entered Venice on May 16, 1797, for the first time in its entire history, across more than 1,000 years from the first settlements of Denano, of refugees in the Lagoon, to the last session of the Great Council. Venice was occupied by a foreign military force. The bronze horses of St. Mark's were removed from the Basilica's facade and transported to Paris, where they were displayed as trophies of the French victory. The Bucintoro, the great ceremonial state galley that had carried the Doge each year to celebrate the marriage to the sea, was stripped of its decorations, degraded, and eventually burned. The ceremonial objects of the Republic were destroyed or dispersed. The Lion of St. Mark was replaced by French revolutionary symbols. Under the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797, Napoleon traded Venice to Austria in exchange for Austrian territorial concessions elsewhere. The city that had defied every enemy for a millennium was exchanged in a diplomatic document without the Venetians being consulted. It remained under Austrian control, with a brief French interlude during the Napoleonic period, until 1866, when it was incorporated into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy following the Third Italian War of Independence. The Republic was gone, but the city, the civilization, and the legacy were not. The disappearance of the Venetian Republic in 1797 marked the end of one of the longest-running experiments in self-governance in human history, a political institution that had survived, in recognizable form, for over 1,000 years. That extraordinary longevity was not merely a political achievement, it was the precondition for everything else that Venice accomplished: the maritime empire, the commercial revolution, the cultural flowering, the artistic legacy that still fills the world's greatest museums. Without the institutional stability that the Republic's carefully designed system of balanced power provided, none of the rest would have been possible. The financial and commercial innovations developed by Venetian and other northern Italian merchants during the medieval and early modern periods formed the practical foundation of the modern global economy. The Bill of Exchange, the financial instrument that allowed merchants to transfer purchasing power across long distances without physically transporting gold, was a Venetian innovation that made transcontinental commerce feasible on a scale that coin-based systems could not support. Marine insurance, invented in the commercial cities of medieval Italy, distributed the enormous risks of long-distance sea voyages in ways that made the investment in such voyages rational. The Commenda and Colleganza partnership contracts allowed merchants who possessed capital to combine resources with merchants who possessed navigational expertise, creating the flexible investment structures that funded commercial expansion. Double-entry bookkeeping, the accounting system that made possible to track complex commercial operations involving multiple partners, multiple currencies, and transactions extending across years, was systematized and taught by the Franciscan friar Luca Pacioli in his 1494 Summa de Arithmetica, published in Venice. The Summa codified practices that had developed in the mercantile culture of northern Italian cities, particularly Venice and Florence, over the preceding century and a half. The accounting revolution that Pacioli described was as consequential for the organization of commercial capitalism as any technical innovation of the period. The vocabulary of modern finance reflects this Venetian and Italian heritage. The word bank comes from the banco, the bench or counter at which money changers conducted their business in the markets of medieval Italian cities. Bankrupt comes from banco rotto, the broken bench, the public acknowledgement that a money changer could no longer meet his obligations. Debit and credit are Latin terms adopted into the accounting systems of Italian merchants. Arsenal comes from the Arabic dar al-sina, workshop, via the Venetian. Quarantine comes directly from Venetian public health policy, the quarantino giorni, 40 days of isolation required of ships arriving from potentially plague-affected ports, a practice first systematically implemented by Venice in 1377 in response to the catastrophic 14th-century plague epidemics that had killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. The artistic legacy of Venice remains among the most accessible and most directly influential of any pre-modern civilization. The paintings of Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Bellini, Giorgiani, Canaletto, and Tiepolo hang in the world's greatest museums and continue to shape the visual imagination of anyone who encounters them. The music of Vivaldi, Monteverdi, who spent the last decades of his life as music director at St. Mark's Basilica, and the Gabrielis remains in active performance. The architecture of Palladeo, developed and tested in Venice and the Veneto, shaped the built environment of England, America, and dozens of other countries through the Palladian revival of the 17th and 18th centuries. Today, Venice exists as a physical archive of its own history, a city in which the past is not merely commemorated, but literally present underfoot, overhead, and reflected in every canal. St. Mark's Square, the Doge's Palace, the Rialto Bridge, the Church of the Frari, with its magnificent Titian altarpiece, the Scuole Grandi, with their cycle paintings, the scattered lion emblazoned fortifications of the former Maritime Empire, across the Adriatic and Aegean coasts, all of these constitute a living museum of civilizational achievement. But Venice also faces threats more immediate than historical memory. The phenomenon of acqua alta high water, flooding that periodically inundates the lowest parts of the city, has become more severe and more frequent as sea levels rise, and the city continues its centuries-long gradual subsidence. The MOSA project, Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, a system of 78 mobile flood barriers installed at the 3 inlets connecting the Lagoon to the Adriatic, was finally completed and became operational in 2020 after decades of engineering work, political controversy, and corruption scandals. In October 2020, MOSE successfully held back what would otherwise have been one of the most damaging floods in recent decades, offering at least the possibility that the engineering creativity that built the city on mud might yet save it from the water that created it. The mass tourism that floods Venice, with approximately 30 million visitors per year, creating crowds in the narrow calli that dwarf the actual resident population, raising property values beyond what ordinary residents can afford, and gradually converting the world's most beautiful inhabited museum into a theme park of itself, presents a different but equally serious long-term challenge. The resident population of the historic center has declined from approximately 170,000 at the end of World War II to fewer than 50,000 today, a demographic hollowing out that threatens the social fabric of the city even as its physical fabric is restored and maintained. Yet, Venice endures, not merely as a monument to a past civilization, but as a living argument demonstrable, extraordinary, and available to any person willing to take a plane or a train and walk across a bridge into the calli on the far side that human creativity, applied to the harshest and most inhospitable of circumstances, can produce something of lasting and perhaps permanent beauty. The community of refugees who fled into the marshes of the Adriatic coast in the 5th century to escape the destruction, sweeping across the late Roman world, did not know that they were laying the foundations of one of history's greatest civilizations. They were simply trying to survive. That the Comte survived, that they built, that they endured, that they created, and that what they created outlasted the very civilization from whose collapse they had fled, is perhaps the most remarkable story in European history. The city born from panic and saltwater never lost the character that its origins imprinted upon it. At its very deepest level, beneath the gold mosaics, beneath the Gothic tracery, beneath the Baroque ceilings and the carnival masks, and the music that floated out across the lagoon on summer evenings, Venice remained what its refugees had made it, a community that had learned to treat impossibility as a beginning, that had discovered how to turn the absence of every conventional resource into the motivation for creating something entirely new. Before it ruled the sea, it learned how not to drown in it. Before it became magnificent, it became stubborn. Before it became proud, it became necessary. And in the end, it became eternal, not because stone and marble do not crumble, but because what it built in the minds and imaginations of the people who encountered it cannot be unbuilt.